"You're done here, effective immediately," my boss said, sliding a manila envelope across the conference table like a closing door. And for a beat, the only sound was the HVAC humming over stale coffee and the faint tick of a wall clock that had measured 15 years of my life. My name is Evelyn Hart, and I am telling this story because quiet people are often mistaken for weak, because loyalty becomes a leash in the wrong hands, and because some endings arrive exactly on schedule when you stop pretending not to read the signs. If you have ever watched your own work paraded under someone else's name, if you have ever sat through applause that skipped your chair, you already know the weight I carried into that room. Stay with me to the end, and if you recognize yourself in any corner of this story, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far a whisper travels when it finally chooses to be a voice. The envelope waited between us like a dare. Its edges were sharp, precise, the way budget cuts are precise when they have faces they'd rather not meet. Outside the glass wall, our December office kept clicking, screens blinking, chairs swiveling, people pretending not to see anything at all. The city was already dark at 4:30, rain stippling the window like static. It smelled of wet wool and printer toner. The two scents I associate with the years I kept my head down and did the work that teams somehow forgot until a deadline was safely met. "Restructuring," he said, and the word was smooth from use, like a coin that had passed from palm to palm until nobody remembered whose pockets it had emptied. I watched his mouth shape the syllables and thought of the nights I wrote recovery plans while my name stayed off the invite list, of holiday weekends traded for launch weekends, of the way gratitude shrank the moment a crisis was solved. The envelope was supposed to shock me. It did not. I had already packed the framed photo from my desk, my father on Coney Island holding a paper cup of coffee, telling me at 19 that you can work with your back straight even when you have to bend. I had already scrubbed my laptop of the notes they didn't deserve, exported what belonged to me, left what belonged to them. When you live in a place long enough, you learn its emergency exits by heart. I learned mine. 15 years is enough time to memorize who calls you only when servers fall and who forgets your birthday while texting you at 11:52 p.m. for a deck that must sing by sunrise. I am not a singer. I am a ledger of the hours no one counted. The first month I started, I labeled every cable beneath my desk and taped a little map to the underside of the keyboard tray. Order calmed me. In year 3, that map became a model for the disaster recovery protocol we still used last week, though in the handbook it bore someone else's name. In year 6, when the client threatening to walk took our holiday party with them, I drafted the compromise that saved the quarter. The email trail shows a different author now. It is funny what people erase when they decide you are safe to forget. I noticed the erasures long before today. They began as smudges, then as tidy rectangles of final documents that excluded my track changes but kept my solutions. A quiet person can become an archive. I became an archive. I also became a habit. Evelyn will fix it. Evelyn will stay. Evelyn won't make noise. That is the only reason this envelope exists. Noise frightens people who owe you something. Silence terrifies them more when you break it on your own terms. I looked at David, my boss with the careful haircut and the watch that always arrived before he did, and I thought of the little tells I had been collecting. The way he stopped CCing me on Tuesday stand-ups 3 weeks ago. The way HR scheduled my benefits review at an odd hour. The way an intern I trained started shadowing meetings where my chair had always been. You can smell a storm if you've ever been rained on without an umbrella. I bought an umbrella. "There's a severance package," he said, and slid a second page forward, already signed, already dated, as if my name were merely a blank that paperwork would politely fill. The words confidential and non-disparagement lived there like iron bars painted a friendly gray. He expected pleading. He expected a tremor. He expected a woman who had learned to apologize for taking up a calendar slot. I gave him none of those. My voice came out steady, a low hallway light. "Is this your final decision?" He nodded. His smile was managerial, the kind that suggests a shared burden when only one set of shoulders has ever carried the weight. I thought of my mother's kitchen table in Queens, The ring of heat a pot leaves in cheap varnish, the way she'd tell me to mark what mattered, because memory is a room other people keep rearranging. So I marked it. The time on the clock, 4:37 p.m. The rain, his cologne like cedar trying too hard, the tremor in his thumb when he tapped the pen. I marked the empty chair to my left, where my mentor used to sit before she learned I was cheaper than her bonus. I marked the small cardboard box already waiting under the conference table, as if a stagehand had set a prop. They wanted me to take my mug in a plant and leave like a dissolving caption. But I had learned another habit in year 10. I kept copies of every plan I wrote longhand in a black notebook my grandfather used for fishing logs. Paper is stubborn, ink resists revision. In margins where no one else looked, I kept dates, outcomes, names, and the short sentences people say when they think they are safe. I am not vengeance, I am record. That is why I'm telling this now. Not to scorch the earth, but to measure it. 15 years deserves a measuring. The envelope was heavier than it looked. I placed it flat on the table and met David's eyes. Behind him, the reflection in the glass showed me small, neat, the way quiet women are framed by offices that don't know what they owe. I used to hate that silhouette. Today it steadied me. I had already made arrangements that did not include this building or its badges. I had already moved the savings I never talked about, the small seed of a different life, into an account with my own name on it and a future that did not require their signatures. I had already spoken with people who knew my work because they had watched me do it at 2 in the morning when everyone else left the call. They knew my voice without my title attached. You can call it foresight. I call it the moment you stop waiting for permission. I picked up my coat, the navy one with the stitched initials my father insisted on paying for when I got the real job, and I pressed the elevator button with the same hand that built other people's safety nets for a decade and a half. Here is the only promise I will make. They assumed my silence would follow me out. It will not. They assumed I learned obedience. I learned exit routes. And by the time they notice what I took with me, they will understand that the quiet person they dismissed had been listening long enough to hear the trapdoor click. The first year, I thought late nights were a rite of passage. Fluorescent lights buzzing at midnight, a half-eaten sandwich stiffening in its wrapper, the hum of the HVAC louder than the voices that had left hours before. I told myself it meant I was essential. No one said thank you. No one even noticed, except when a deck was finished, a crisis averted, a deadline quietly met. By the third year, I understood the rhythm. I solved what others abandoned, and the next morning someone else presented it as their victory. Applause followed them into meetings. Silence followed me back to my desk. Once, during an all-hands, a director praised Marcus for the brilliant restructuring plan that had saved the quarter. My own handwriting was still on the margins of the printout he carried. The room clapped. He winked at me afterward, a thank you without cost. I smiled back because that was what people like me did. We swallowed our names like pills and kept moving. Christmas parties were the hardest. Champagne glasses, glittering dresses, music echoing through rented ballrooms, while I sat in my apartment with a laptop on my knees. A quick revision always arrived the day of the party. You don't mind, Evelyn, do you? The truth was they knew I wouldn't refuse. I told myself it was temporary, that eventually consistency would outweigh politics. But politics has a longer memory than effort. Year 6. I submitted a proposal that could have streamlined an entire department's workflow. Weeks later, I watched it unveiled under another manager's name. He won an award for innovation. I was given an extra project. The certificate framed on his wall still bore the title I had written word for word. I learned then to stop expecting fairness. Recognition is a currency, and I was always paid in silence. My father's birthday fell on the same weekend as a client emergency. I asked to leave early, just once, to catch the train to Queens. "We need you here, Evelyn," David had said, his tone heavy with that mixture of authority and condescension only certain men perfect. I stayed. My father blew out his candles without me, and a week later his heart gave out before I could make it up to him. That was the real cost of my loyalty. Not money, not title, but time I would never recover. Colleagues rose around me, their resumes polished by words I had written, their careers lifted on the scaffolding of my labor. They brought back trinkets from conferences I never attended, showed photos from vacations my overtime had funded for them. I learned to clap at their promotions with steady hands, to nod at their speeches without letting the heat in my chest show. At times, I thought of leaving, but the job had become a mirror. It showed me tired, diminished, necessary, but never wanted. Quitting felt like admitting I had been foolish to stay, so I stayed longer, convincing myself that endurance would one day be its own proof. Endurance is not proof. It is erasure in slow motion. In year 10, a junior associate I trained was promoted above me. He asked if I could ghostwrite his first big presentation. I did. He called me a lifesaver in private and his support team in public. That same week, my rent went up, and I cut back on groceries to afford the copay for a prescription. He celebrated with champagne. I boiled rice 3 nights straight. They thought I didn't notice the meetings I stopped being invited to, the projects reassigned without explanation, the way conversations hushed when I entered a room. But I noticed. I marked each slight the way you mark pages in a book you don't intend to finish but want to remember. Small betrayals accumulate. They become architecture. By the 15th year, I was living inside a building made entirely of omissions. The cruelest part was how ordinary it all seemed. No one shouted, no one slammed doors. They just looked past me, as if effort had become wallpaper. I was the structure holding everything up, and because I never collapsed, they assumed I never could. But cracks had already spread through me. Missed birthdays, a father's funeral I nearly skipped for a deadline, friendships that dissolved under the weight of unanswered texts. Sacrifices that looked invisible to them, but carved me hollow. That is the truth of my past at this company. Not a single catastrophe, but 15 years of small cuts no one cared to bandage. The applause always aimed elsewhere. The credit always redirected. The silence always mine to carry. And yet, through all of it, I remained. Not because I was blind, but because I wanted to believe loyalty meant something. I see now that it did. It meant I was the safest one to use. They thought endurance was consent. They thought silence was weakness. They thought I would never leave. They were wrong. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that smelled of burnt coffee and printer ink, the kind where the elevator stalled just long enough to remind you how fragile cables could be. I had almost made peace with invisibility when the company announced a sudden town hall. Mandatory attendance, 4:30 sharp in the main conference room, the kind of summons that never meant good news. The air was tense even before I walked in. Screens flickered with slides already prepared, and someone had set bottled water at every seat as if hydration could soften the blow. David stood at the front, posture polished, smile rehearsed. Behind him, a younger woman I barely knew adjusted the microphone. I had trained her less than a year ago. She was the one chosen to deliver the vision for the future. David cleared his throat. "We are restructuring to stay competitive," he began, the phrase as hollow as the envelope he would later slide across the table. "We need fresh perspectives, new energy, people who can adapt quickly to the evolving market." Each word landed like a dismissal before it was even spoken. Fresh, new, adapt, all the coded synonyms for younger, cheaper, replaceable. My name was not mentioned, but my absence was already implied. Then came the sentence that sliced through the room like glass shattering. "Effective immediately, Evelyn Hart will no longer be with the company." A silence followed, so loud it felt physical. 15 years erased in less than 10 words. No applause, no gratitude, not even a polite nod in my direction. The young woman beside him smiled nervously, holding a stack of papers that bore charts I had once drafted. She called them her initiatives. My breath caught, not from surprise, but from recognition. They had been testing my boundaries for months, taking notes from my proposals, quietly moving me out of rooms. This was the climax of a play I had already seen rehearsed. Still, to hear my name spoken like a line item crossed off a list cracked something inside me. My body remembered the years of weekends surrendered, of birthdays skipped, of dinners eaten cold beside glowing monitors. I could see my father's grave, still damp from rain, where I had stood alone because a launch demanded my presence. I could hear my mother's voice asking why I never visited, my excuses typed out in bullet points on Sunday nights. All of it condensed into this single announcement, this sterile declaration of redundancy. People shifted in their seats, some avoiding my gaze, some offering the kind of sympathetic half-smile that evaporates as soon as eyes meet. One man muttered, "I'm sorry, Evelyn," as if sorry could balance the equation. David went on, speaking about growth opportunities, about bold futures, about embracing change. The irony was suffocating. Every strategy he described had been seeded by me, drafted in margins, tested in late nights that belonged to no one else. I knew the data, the architecture, the fragile scaffolding holding up his promises, and I knew none of them would admit it. My chair felt smaller than it had a moment ago. I placed my hands flat on the polished table, tracing the grain of the wood, grounding myself, while the rest of the room clapped politely for the woman replacing me. She beamed, thanking the leadership team for believing in her. Belief. That was the word I had starved for all those years, withheld until it was no longer needed. I studied her, not with anger but with clarity. She was not the villain. She was the vessel they had chosen, the one who would inherit the fruits of soil I had tilled in silence. My anger was reserved for David, for the system that thrives on discarding what has already proven steady. The meeting ended with applause, the kind that echoes against walls but never touches the skin. I stood slowly, the envelope heavy in my hand, and walked out without a word. The hallway was lined with glass offices, each pane reflecting me back at myself. Small, composed, forgettable. But inside, a storm gathered. Betrayal does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It whispers when you notice your calendar suddenly emptier. It whispers when your name vanishes from a deck. It whispers when colleagues who once leaned on you begin rehearsing life without you. Today, the whisper became a verdict. Outside, the sky had bruised to purple, the city lights blinking awake like indifferent eyes. I pulled my coat tighter, felt the slip of the envelope under my arm, and realized I was not crushed. I was not broken. I was stripped bare. Yes, but beneath the erosion was something harder than they expected. They thought they had ended me. What they had done was mark the exact moment my silence became history. I walked into the night, past the glow of office windows, past the shadows of men in suits laughing into phones. My phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. I didn't know they'd announce it like that. You deserved better. Better was not coming from them. Better was something I would have to claim. And as the rain began to fall, cooling the heat in my chest, I understood the truth. Betrayal had not destroyed me. It had freed me. Hey, called it a farewell gathering. But the word tasted false the moment it left David's mouth. A farewell is something you give with warmth, with gratitude, with at least the pretense of respect. This was a stage performance, a room dressed in balloons and paper banners that said, "Good luck, Evelyn," in fonts chosen by an intern who probably had no idea what I had endured. The conference room smelled of cheap catering, finger sandwiches curling at the edges, fruit platters sweating under plastic wrap, the kind of spread reserved for people whose absence means relief, not loss. My colleagues clapped when I entered, hesitant claps, polite claps, the kind of applause that dies too quickly. Their eyes avoided mine. David stood at the front again, voice smooth, thanking me for 15 years of dedicated service. The words slid across the room like oil across water, never sinking, never connecting. I watched his lips move and thought of all the nights those lips had formed the words, "We need you here, Evelyn," and how I had obeyed at the cost of everything that mattered. He praised my supportive nature, as if silence and obedience were the only qualities I had ever carried. The applause that followed was thinner than the paper plates stacked near the coffee urn. I stood still, calm, letting the hollowness settle. Then I placed a small folder on the table beside me. It looked ordinary, gray cardboard, slightly worn at the edges. But inside was not ordinary. Inside was a record of every forgotten credit, every erased contribution, every signed document that bore my handwriting, even when another name was printed at the top. I had never planned to show it. For years, it was simply my archive, my reminder that I was not invisible even if they insisted otherwise. But betrayal has a way of unlocking doors you swore would stay shut. "Before I leave," I said, my voice steady, low, "I want to share something." Conversation stilled. Forks hovered over plates. Even David's smile faltered just for a second. I opened the folder and slid out the first page. An email chain from year 6, my proposal for restructuring printed in black and white. the very plan Marcus had received an award for. My signature in the metadata, my words copied line for line. Gasps rose like a current through the room. Someone muttered, "I remember that quarter." Another page. Financial models I had built during year 10, later presented by a junior associate who had called me a lifesaver in private and claimed the glory in public. My handwriting in the margins, calculations only I could have made. More murmurs, sharper now. I watched the faces shift, surprise, unease, recognition. David's jaw tightened. "Evelyn, this isn't necessary," he began, his voice a little too quick. I met his eyes, unflinching. 15 years of silence was more than necessary. This is truth. I laid down another document, a project plan that had saved a major contract. My name had been erased from the final report, replaced with someone else's, but the draft still carried my initials. I heard someone whisper, "She wrote that? All of it?" The young woman who had replaced me sat stiffly, color draining from her face, as she realized the foundation beneath her promotion was mine. She was not to blame, but the truth does not spare the innocent when it is unveiled. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply placed each piece of paper down, like cards in a game that had already been won. The silence grew heavier with each one. The weight of undeniable proof filled the room until even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. Finally, I closed the folder, placed my hand on top of it, and let the stillness linger. "You wanted me gone because I was quiet," I said softly. "Because I never demanded recognition. But quiet does not mean blind, and loyalty does not mean weakness." My words did not need volume, they carried their own gravity. I looked around the room, at faces I had once trusted, at people who had borrowed my effort and returned indifference. I don't need applause now. I don't need a speech. I only need you to remember that the structure you stand on was built by the hands you dismissed. David tried to laugh, to wave it off as misunderstanding, but the laughter caught in his throat. Too many eyes had seen. Too many minds had connected the pieces. Reputation is fragile. Once cracked, it cannot be glued back into shape. The young woman shifted uncomfortably, her gaze on the papers as if they were burning. A few colleagues stood a little straighter as though realizing they had been complicit. Others looked away, shame written in the tightness of their mouths. I gathered the folder, slid the papers back in, and tucked it under my arm. The truth had already done its work. It needed no dramatics, no flourish, only exposure. As I walked toward the door, no one clapped. No one cheered. The banner that wished me good luck sagged slightly, tape peeling from the wall. For the first time in 15 years, the silence belonged to them, not me. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing, and felt lighter than I had in years. They had thought dismissal would erase me. Instead, it revealed them. The collapse did not come with an explosion. It arrived like a slow leak in a ceiling, drip by drip, until the plaster gave way and everything beneath was ruined. A week after my so-called farewell, the first cracks showed. A client, one of the largest accounts we had, requested a meeting. They had been reviewing proposals and noticed the same language repeated across multiple presentations. Identical phrasing, identical formatting, even the same typos. My typos. I knew because I had written those drafts. When the client asked who had produced the work, David gave the name of the young woman they had promoted. But the client was not naive. They had corresponded with me for years, had heard my voice on late-night calls, had seen my initials at the bottom of every emergency report. They recognized the mismatch instantly. Their tone shifted from curiosity to suspicion. The meeting ended without a contract renewal. Within days, whispers spread. Other clients began to question deliverables, to request proof of authorship, to examine whether the innovation they had been promised was anything more than recycled material stripped of its source. Emails surfaced. Threads with my drafts attached, timelines that made no sense without my contribution. Every document I had preserved became a mirror reflecting their deception. And mirrors once cracked, cut deeply. Inside the company, unease grew. The young woman promoted in my place struggled under the weight of expectations she had not built the muscles to carry. Projects faltered. Deadlines slipped. Her confidence eroded in public, in meetings where she once smiled brightly but now fumbled for words. It was not her fault. She had been handed stolen scaffolding, and without me there to hold it up, it collapsed. The board began to ask questions. Why had performance declined? Why were clients leaving? Why did revenue projections suddenly look like wishful thinking rather than strategy? David's answers grew thinner, his once steady voice breaking into defensive tones. "We are adjusting to transition," he said. "We are aligning for growth." But growth does not wait for excuses. Numbers told the story he tried to bury. Decline, attrition, distrust. Colleagues who had once clapped politely in meetings began to distance themselves. Loyalty in an office is as fragile as glass. Once a leader's credibility shatters, no one wants to cut their hands picking up the pieces. I heard from a former coworker that partners were considering withdrawing support. The board demanded explanations for discrepancies in project ownership. Someone had leaked documents, copies of the same folder I had laid on the table that day. My proof had traveled farther than I expected, passed quietly from desk to desk until it reached eyes that mattered. David's polished mask began to slip. His meetings grew shorter, his temper sharper. He snapped at questions he once brushed off with charm. The man who had dismissed me with a smile now faced the same silence he had given me. The silence of colleagues who no longer believed. The young woman eventually resigned. Too much pressure, too much scrutiny, too many whispers that she was only a placeholder for work that was never hers. I felt no triumph in her departure, only a cold recognition that she had been a pawn, used as easily as I had been ignored. The company's losses mounted. Contracts dissolved, investors pulled back, and in a matter of months, the future David had promised in that town hall became ash. He was removed by the board in a closed-door meeting. No farewell, no applause, no banners sagging from tape. Just an announcement in an email, bland and clinical, stripped of ceremony. The same way he had dismissed me. I did not need to see his face to imagine it. I knew the look of a man cornered by the truth, the twitch of the jaw, the sweat at the temple, the realization that reputation is harder to rebuild than revenue. Word reached me through quiet channels. David had lost not only his title, but the trust that once bought him invitations and influence. He was a man remembered for betrayal, not for leadership. And betrayal stains deeper than failure. For years, I had been the ghost who carried the weight. Now the weight had found its rightful shoulders. I walked past the building one evening, the windows glowing pale against the night. Inside, new names filled the directories. New faces hurried down hallways where mine had once gone unnoticed. But the air felt different, thinner, unsettled. The company was no longer a fortress. It was a cautionary tale. The fall was not mine to orchestrate. I had not shouted, had not threatened, had not sought revenge. I had simply shown the truth. And the truth, once seen, does not close its eyes. That is how justice arrives. Not with fire, not with fury, but with the quiet collapse of lies that cannot hold their own weight. David paid his price, not because I demanded it, but because deceit always collects its debt. I did not return to the office after David's fall. There was nothing left for me there. No satisfaction in walking those halls again. No urge to stand over his empty chair and feel vindicated. Vindication had already arrived, not through my hands, but through the natural collapse of a structure built on deception. What I wanted now was quiet, not the enforced silence I had endured for 15 years, but the kind that belongs to you, the kind that is earned. I rented a small cabin 2 hours north, a place with creaking wooden floors and a porch that looked out over a lake, so still it felt like glass. The mornings smelled of pine and wet earth, and in the evenings, the sky opened into stars I had not noticed in years, too busy staring at spreadsheets under fluorescent lights. My days became unrecognizable. Instead of alarm clocks and train rides, I woke with the sun slipping through thin curtains. I brewed coffee not because I needed fuel to survive meetings, but because I enjoyed the sound of it percolating, the warmth spreading through my hands as I sat on the porch. I read books I had once stacked on nightstands and never opened. I cooked meals slowly, without checking emails between chopping onions. I began to sketch again, a habit I had abandoned in college, my hands remembering lines and shadows like an old language rediscovered. Sometimes I thought of the office, of faces that had looked through me, of the years I had surrendered. But the memories no longer felt heavy. They felt like stones I had finally put down. I could see the outline of my former life clearly, and clarity itself was freedom. I received an email once from a former colleague. You were right, it said simply. Attached was an article detailing the company's ongoing struggles, its reputation still scarred. I closed the email without replying. Being right was no longer my concern. Living was. One afternoon, as the wind moved across the lake and carried the smell of rain, I realized something essential. Loyalty without respect is just servitude. Work without recognition is just erosion. Silence without choice is just a prison. For too long, I had mistaken endurance for virtue, had believed that giving more would eventually balance the scale, but the scale had never been built for me. It had been built for those who thrive on taking. That is the lesson I want to leave behind. If you see yourself in my story, if you have sat in rooms where your voice was ignored, if you have given years that were never acknowledged, know this: you are not invisible. You are not weak. You are not disposable. You may feel like the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one carrying weight others never notice. But quiet people hold the kind of strength that lasts when applause fades. One day, truth will find its way to light, and those who dismissed you will face the cost of their blindness. That is not revenge. That is balance. And balance always comes, though sometimes later than we wish. As I sit now, the lake reflecting a sky painted in orange and violet, I feel no urge for confrontation, no hunger for recognition. My peace is not in their downfall, but in my freedom. The past cannot be rewritten, but the future is still mine to shape, and I will shape it with steady hands, not for their approval, but for my own life. If you followed me to the end of this story, stay with me a little longer. Share where you are listening from, because I want to know how far these words can travel. And if you want more stories like this, stories of truth surfacing, of silence breaking, of balance restored, subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it means everything, because together we remind the world that quiet voices still carry. My name is Evelyn Hart. I gave 15 years to people who did not deserve them, but the years ahead are mine, and for the first time, they are not a burden. They are a promise.